The wind carries whispers across these plains, tales older than the barbed wire fences, deeper than the scars gouged into the earth by wagon wheels and desperation. It speaks of grit, of heartbreak, of the kind of silence that settles heavy after a gunshot, and the kind that blankets a lone cabin when the last ember dies in the hearth. Out here, under a sky vast and unforgiving, life wasn't measured in years, but in winters survived, in harvests brought in against the odds, in the quiet courage it took just to face another dawn when the world seemed determined to break you. This ain't a land for the faint of heart, never was. It demands resilience, asks for everything you've got, and sometimes even that ain't enough. But it's also a place where character is forged in the crucible of hardship, where unexpected kindness can bloom like a stubborn wildflower in parched soil, and where the true measure of a soul is revealed when everything else is stripped away. Listen close now, and I'll tell you a story from that time. It's a tale about a woman named Eliza, about the fierce love that burned in her heart like a banked fire against the encroaching cold, and about the stranger who drifted into her life like tumbleweed caught on the wind, carrying shadows and secrets, and maybe, just maybe, a chance. It happened in the heart of the Wyoming Territory, a place where the mountains clawed at the sky and the wind never seemed to stop its mournful song, a place where hope was a fragile commodity, easily scattered. The dust devil danced across the yard, a mocking little ghost spinning dead leaves and grit against the weathered planks of the cabin. Eliza watched it from the doorway, her hand resting protectively on the rough-hewn frame, her knuckles white. Inside, the air was thick with a silence that felt heavier than sorrow. It was the silence of an empty larder, the quiet dread of a mother who knows the bottom of the flour sack is closer than the next sunrise ought to be. Winter was breathing down their necks, a cold promise carried on that same restless wind. The aspens on the ridge had already surrendered their gold, standing stark and skeletal against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. Soon the snows would come, locking them into this unforgiving valley, burying the already barren land under a shroud of white. And they had nothing, less than nothing. Her husband John had built this place with his own 2 hands, wrestling it timber by timber from the stubborn land. He'd poured his sweat, his dreams, his very lifeblood into these acres, believing in the promise of the West, the chance to carve out something lasting for his family. He'd seen potential where others saw only desolation, but the land, like a fickle lover, had betrayed him. A flash flood 2 springs ago had taken the best of their topsoil downriver. Last year's drought had baked the earth hard as fired clay. And then, just as the meager crop they'd managed to coax from the reluctant ground was ripening, the locusts had come, a whirring, devouring cloud that blotted out the sun and left behind only stripped stalks and shattered hope. John hadn't survived the despair. A fever took him quick, some said. Others whispered it was a broken heart, a spirit worn down by the relentless struggle until it simply gave out. Eliza didn't dwell on the whispers. She just missed the steady strength of his hand beside hers, the low rumble of his voice planning for a future that would never arrive. Now it was just her, 10-year-old Caleb, and 6-year-old Sarah. Caleb, trying so hard to fill shoes too big for him, his face set in a serious mask that didn't quite hide the fear in his young eyes. He'd taken to carrying John's old rifle, though it was nearly as tall as he was, patrolling the perimeter of their small claim as if he could somehow scare away hunger itself. Sarah, small and quiet, her big eyes seeming to absorb all the worry that hung in the air, clutching the worn rag doll John had carved for her. She coughed sometimes, a dry, hacking sound that sent splinters of fear into Eliza's heart. Winter sickness was a swift and silent killer out here. Eliza drew a shaky breath, the cold air biting at her lungs. She'd stretched their supplies thinner than spider silk, watered the milk, thinned the stew until it was mostly broth, rationed the bread slice by slice. They'd eaten the last of the salt pork weeks ago. The jerky was gone. The root cellar held only a few withered potatoes and a handful of onions. Caleb had tried hunting, bless his heart. He'd spent days tracking rabbits, squirrels, anything that moved, but the game seemed to have vanished along with their luck. He'd come home empty-handed each time, his shoulders slumped, the forced bravery crumbling around the edges. Tonight's supper had been boiled potatoes, 2 small ones each. Eliza had pretended she wasn't hungry, giving her share to the children, watching them eat with a hollow ache in her own stomach that had nothing to do with food. Caleb had tried to refuse, puffing out his chest. "Ma, you need it more." But she'd insisted, forcing a smile. "Nonsense. Gotta keep your strength up, little man. Might find a deer tomorrow." He knew she was lying. She saw it in the way his gaze dropped to his plate. Sarah had eaten hers slowly, meticulously, as if trying to make the meager portion last forever. Afterwards, curled by the feeble fire in the stone hearth, Sarah had asked in her small voice, "Mama, are we going to be hungry forever?" Eliza had pulled her close, stroking her fine corn silk hair. "No, sweetheart, no. Things will get better. Papa wouldn't want us to give up." But the words felt like ashes in her mouth. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. Desperation was a cold, hard stone in her gut. She'd thought about riding to Lander, the nearest town such as it was, a rough collection of false-fronted buildings clinging to the banks of the Popo Agie River, a good day's hard ride away. But what could she offer? She had no money, nothing left to trade. John had taken a small loan from Jedediah Thorne, the man who owned the mercantile and half the valley besides, secured against the ranch itself. Thorne wasn't known for his charity. He had eyes like chips of frozen creek water and a grip on a dollar tighter than a rusted clamp. He'd already sent word once, inquiring about the payment that was now overdue, his tone polite but hinting at the steel beneath. Going to him for help felt like walking into a wolf's den carrying a lamb. She scanned the horizon one last time as the light bled from the sky. The land stretched out, vast and indifferent. Empty, so terribly empty. Was there truly no help to be found? No deliverance? She closed the door, the latch clicking shut with a sound of finality, plunging the cabin into the deeper gloom of evening, broken only by the flickering firelight. She moved towards the hearth, her body aching with fatigue and a bone-deep chill that had little to do with the temperature. She had to be strong for the children. She had to find a way. But tonight, huddled between her sleeping son and daughter, the weight of it all felt crushing, unbearable. She closed her eyes, not daring to pray for a miracle, but simply for the strength to endure one more night, one more dawn. The wind moaned around the cabin like a hungry beast, and Eliza shivered, pulling the thin blanket tighter around her children, offering the only warmth she had left. The days that followed bled into one another, each a repetition of the last, marked only by the dwindling supplies and the growing hollowness in their bellies. The cold deepened its grip, frosting the single window pane each morning with intricate, icy ferns. Caleb continued his futile hunts, his face growing thinner, his youthful optimism eroding like the riverbank in the spring melt. Sarah's cough worsened, rattling in her small chest, and her usual quietness became tinged with a lethargy that terrified Eliza more than any outburst would have. Eliza portioned out the last of the potatoes, then the onions. She boiled leather scraps from John's old boots, hoping to extract some meager sustenance, but the resulting broth was thin and bitter. She found a half-forgotten pouch of dried beans, infested with weevils, but she painstakingly picked them clean, rationing them out bean by bean. Hunger gnawed constantly, a dull ache that sharpened into painful cramps, blurring thought, shortening tempers. Fear was a constant companion, sitting beside her at the hearth, lying beside her in the cold bed. One particularly bleak afternoon, when the sky hung low and gray, spitting icy pellets of sleet, Eliza was trying to mend Caleb's worn trousers near the window, her fingers stiff with cold. Sarah lay listlessly on the pallet bed, her breathing shallow. Caleb sat hunched by the door, whittling aimlessly at a piece of wood, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The silence in the cabin was broken only by Sarah's occasional cough and the relentless howl of the wind. Eliza's stomach clenched. They wouldn't last the week like this. She had to do something. Anything. Maybe she could trade her wedding band in Lander. The thought felt like a betrayal of John, of everything they'd built, but the image of Sarah's pale face, Caleb's haunted eyes, What good was sentiment when her children were starving? She'd ride tomorrow, weather permitting. She'd swallow her pride, face thorn if she had to, beg if necessary. Just as she steeled her resolve, a movement outside caught her eye. Through the sleet-streaked window pane, she saw it, a figure on horseback, emerging slowly from the gray curtain of the storm. Not Thorne's familiar buggy, nor anyone she recognized from Lander. A lone rider, head bowed against the wind, horse plodding wearily, dark shapes against the bleak landscape. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird trapped in her ribs. Strangers out here rarely meant good news. They could be drifters, outlaws, men running from something, or towards trouble, especially one appearing like an apparition out of the heart of a storm. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice tight. "Get the rifle. Stay back from the door." Caleb scrambled up, his eyes wide but instantly obedient. He fetched John's heavy Winchester from its pegs by the hearth, his small hands gripping the stock. Eliza moved to the door, peering through a crack in the weathered wood. The rider was closer now, moving with a slow, deliberate pace, not like someone scouting for trouble, more like someone utterly exhausted or lost. He wore a long, dark duster coated in sleet and a low-brimmed hat that hid his face. The horse looked near-foundered, head hanging low, ribs showing even beneath the winter coat. He stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, sitting motionless for a long moment, as if gathering his strength or deciding his next move. Then, slowly, he raised a hand, not in threat, but almost in weary greeting, or perhaps supplication. Eliza's mind raced. Turn him away? In this weather it was a death sentence. But letting a stranger in, a man she knew nothing about, with her children vulnerable. It went against every instinct for self-preservation she had. Yet, looking at the slumped figure, the exhausted horse, another instinct warred within her, the simple human pull of compassion. What if he was just someone caught in the storm, desperate as they were? Could she condemn him to freeze or starve, knowing what that felt like? John wouldn't have. Despite the hardness the frontier demanded, John had possessed a core of decency, a belief in helping folks when you could. "Ma," Caleb whispered from behind her, the rifle held awkwardly but resolutely. She took a deep breath. "Stay put, Caleb. Don't show yourself unless I call." She smoothed her apron, trying to project a calm she didn't feel, and opened the door a few inches wider. "You lost, mister?" Her voice carried over the wind, sharper than she intended. The man didn't move immediately. Then slowly, he urged his horse a few steps closer, stopping again at a respectful distance. He pushed back his hat brim just enough for her to see his face. It was a hard face, weathered and lined like old leather, etched by sun and wind and perhaps more than that. Dark eyes, deep-set and shadowed, regarded her steadily. He looked tired, bone-tired, but there was no overt menace in his gaze, just a profound weariness. He wasn't young, maybe 40 or so, lean and sinewy beneath the heavy coat. A scar, thin and white, cut across his left cheekbone. "Ma'am." His voice was low, rough, like stones grinding together, but quiet. "Didn't mean to trespass. Got caught in this squall. My horse, she's done in. Wondered if I might could shelter in your barn, just till the storm passes. Won't cause no trouble." Eliza hesitated. The barn was small, drafty, but offered some protection. It was away from the cabin, offered a measure of distance. Still, having him on her property. "We don't have much here," she said, her voice steadier now. "Not much food to spare." It was an understatement bordering on a lie of omission. They had no food to spare. The stranger nodded slowly, his gaze flickering briefly towards the cabin, then back to her. "Not asking for food, ma'am. Just shelter from the wind. Happy to pay for the trouble, though I ain't got much coin." He shifted slightly in the saddle, a movement that spoke of stiffness and cold. She looked at his horse again. The poor creature was trembling, coated in ice. Leaving it out would surely kill it. And the man, he looked little better. Could she live with herself if she turned him away? "The barn's not much," she said finally, making the decision, "but you'm welcome to it. Just till the weather breaks. There's a little hay left for your horse. A flicker of something, relief, crossed his face, softening the harsh lines for a fraction of a second. Obliged, ma'am. Truly obliged. He swung down stiffly from the saddle, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't make any sudden moves, kept his hands visible. He wore a gun belt, low slung, the holster tied down, the mark of a man familiar with firearms, but his hand stayed well away from the Colt Peacemaker nestled there. "Name's Silas," he offered quietly, leading the horse towards the small, leaning barn adjacent to the cabin. "Eliza Moore," she replied, watching him closely. "My husband, he's passed." She felt it important to establish that, to let him know she was alone, but perhaps also as a subtle warning. Silas just nodded again, his expression unreadable. "Sorry for your loss, ma'am." He led the horse into the relative darkness of the barn. Eliza stood in the doorway for a moment longer, the sleet stinging her face, watching the barn door swing shut. Had she made a terrible mistake? Letting a stranger, possibly a dangerous one, onto her land when she was at her most vulnerable? Or had she simply done what any decent person would do? She didn't know. All she knew was that the fragile, precarious balance of their survival had just shifted, and she had no idea if it was for better or for worse. She closed the cabin door, the wind seeming to whisper his name, Silas, like a premonition. Inside, Caleb lowered the rifle slightly, looking at her with questioning eyes. "He's just sheltering in the barn, Caleb," she said, trying to sound reassuring. "He'll be gone when the storm passes." But even as she said it, a knot of unease tightened in her stomach. Nothing was ever that simple out here. The storm raged for 2 days, imprisoning them all in their respective shelters. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the cabin walls, and the sleet turned to heavy, wet snow that piled in drifts against the door and barn. Through the frosted window, Eliza could see no sign of Silas, only the occasional wisp of smoke curling from the small rusted stovepipe John had rigged up in the barn long ago for calving season, a sign that the stranger was managing to keep from freezing. She sent Caleb out once, bundled against the blizzard, with a bucket of water for the horse and strict instructions not to linger or engage the man. Caleb returned quickly, his face pinched with cold, reporting only that the man had thanked him quietly and taken the water. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere grew heavier. The last of the beans were gone. They were down to chewing on strips of dried apple, brittle and tasteless, salvaged from the very bottom of a forgotten barrel. Sarah's cough persisted, and she barely had the energy to lift her head. Eliza felt a rising panic, cold and sharp. The wedding band felt heavy on her finger. Lander seemed a world away, buried under snow. Even if the storm broke, travel would be treacherous, maybe impossible for days. And Thorne, the loan payment, it all pressed down on her. On the third morning, the wind finally dropped. The snow stopped falling, leaving behind a world transformed, muffled and blindingly white under a pale, watery sun. The drifts were deep, higher than Caleb's head in places. Escape was impossible for now. They were well and truly trapped, and they had nothing left to eat, absolutely nothing. Eliza stared out at the pristine, hostile landscape, despair washing over her in a cold wave. This was it. This was how it ended. Not with a bang, but with a slow, quiet fade into starvation and cold. She sank onto the rough wooden stool by the hearth, burying her face in her hands, the tears she'd held back for so long finally threatening to spill. A soft knock sounded at the door. Eliza froze. Caleb, sensing the tension, instinctively reached for the rifle again. It couldn't be Thorne, not through this snow. It had to be the stranger, Silas. "Ma'am?" His voice was muffled by the door and the snow. "Eliza? You all right in there?" She hesitated, then wiped her eyes quickly on her apron. We're all right," she called back, her voice thick. A pause. Then, "Heard the little one coughing. And, well, haven't seen much smoke from your chimney last day or so. Just wanted to check." His concern, unexpected and quietly offered, pricked at her defenses. Maybe he wasn't a threat. Maybe. She glanced at Sarah, pale and weak on the pallet, at Caleb's thin face. his eyes too large for his head. What did she have left to lose? "Stay back, Caleb," she murmured, and went to the door, lifting the latch. Silas stood there, snow dusting his shoulders, his hat pulled low. He held something bundled in a piece of burlap. His eyes, when they met hers, seemed to assess the situation quickly. Her red-rimmed eyes, the desperate tension in her stance, the unnatural quiet within the cabin. "Storms broke," he said simply. "But the drifts are bad. Reckon no one's getting through to Lander for a spell." He shifted the bundle slightly. "Found these yesterday, ma'am, while I was checking my trap lines just before the worst hit." He held out the bundle. Eliza stared at it, then slowly reached out and took it. It was surprisingly heavy. Unfolding the coarse burlap, she gasped. Inside lay 3 plump prairie chickens, already plucked and cleaned. Food. Real food. Enough for several meals. Tears welled in her eyes again, this time not from despair, but from a confusing mix of relief, gratitude, and suspicion. Why would he do this? A stranger? What did he want in return? I don't understand," she stammered, looking up at him. "Trap lines?" Silas shuffled his feet, looking slightly uncomfortable, avoiding her direct gaze. "Set a few snares when I first got here," he mumbled. "Force of habit. Didn't expect to catch anything this quick, especially in that weather. Lucky, I guess." He finally met her eyes. Figured you could use 'em more'n me." Eliza clutched the burlap, the weight of the birds a solid, unbelievable reality. We have nothing to pay you with, Silas." He gave a slight shake of his head. "Didn't ask for pay, ma'am. Just neighborly." He hesitated. "Look, Eliza, I couldn't help but notice things seem tight. If you'd allow it, maybe I could help out some while I'm stuck here. Chopping wood, clearing a path. Maybe see if I can track something bigger now the snow's stopped." She looked at him, really looked at him. The hard face, the scar, the gun belt, they were still there. But his eyes held a quiet sincerity, a weariness that seemed different now, less menacing, more human. And he had offered food when they were starving, offered help without asking for anything. Could she afford to turn him down? Could she afford not to? "The children," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They haven't eaten properly in days. Sarah, she's sick." A flicker of something pained crossed Silas's face. "Let me help," he said, his voice still low, but with a new firmness. "No obligation. Just till the way is clear." She looked back into the cabin, at Caleb watching them with wide, uncertain eyes, at Sarah stirring weakly on the pallet. Then she looked back at Silas, standing solid against the blinding white snow, offering a lifeline she was too desperate to refuse. "All right, Silas," she said, the words feeling momentous, heavy with unknown consequence. "All right, you can help." She stepped back, holding the door open wider. "Come in out of the cold." Silas hesitated for only a second, then ducked his head and stepped over the threshold, bringing the scent of snow, pine, and wood smoke into the small, desperate cabin. The balance had shifted again. A stranger was inside her home, a man of shadows and secrets, but he had brought food, offered help. Eliza didn't know if she'd invited salvation or danger across her doorstep, but as the aroma of roasting prairie chicken began to fill the air a short while later, mingled with the wood smoke from the replenished fire Silas expertly built, a tiny, fragile seed of hope began to push through the frozen ground of her despair. It was a dangerous thing, hope, but right now, it tasted almost as good as the food. Silas moved with a quiet efficiency that was both reassuring and slightly unnerving. He wasted no motion, spoke little unless spoken to, but seemed to see everything that needed doing. While Eliza tended to the roasting birds, her hands trembling slightly with anticipation and the unfamiliarity of preparing such a feast, Silas took the axe and went out to attack the woodpile, which had dwindled to almost nothing. The rhythmic thud of the axe-splitting logs was a solid, comforting sound against the vast silence of the snow-covered landscape. He then set about clearing a path from the cabin door to the barn and the outhouse, his movements powerful and tireless, carving a channel through the deep drifts with a shovel he'd found in the barn. Caleb watched him, initially from the window, rifle still within reach, his suspicion warring with a boyish curiosity. Silas didn't try to engage him directly at first, just went about his work. But when Caleb ventured out, ostensibly to check the wood supply Silas was building up, Silas paused. "Need to keep that fire fed proper," Silas said, his voice mild. He nodded towards the axe leaning against the chopping block. "Your pa teach you how to split wood?" Caleb puffed out his chest slightly. "Yes, sir. Some." "Show me," Silas said, stepping back. Hesitantly, Caleb took the axe. It was heavy for him, but he positioned a log carefully and swung. The blow landed off-center, glancing off the wood. Silas didn't laugh or criticize. "Keep your eye on the spot you want to hit," he advised quietly. "Let the weight of the axe do the work, and watch your feet." He adjusted Caleb's stance slightly. "Try again." Caleb swung again, concentrating fiercely. This time the axe bit deep, splitting the log cleanly. A grin split Caleb's face, chasing away some of the shadows. "Good," Silas said, with a brief nod that somehow conveyed more approval than effusive praise might have. "Keep at it. Practice makes perfect." He went back to shoveling snow, leaving Caleb to his task, a subtle shift occurring between them. The cautious respect of a boy finding a capable male figure, however mysterious. Inside, the smell of roasting meat was almost intoxicating. Eliza dished it up onto the plates, generous portions for the children, a smaller one for herself. She hesitated, then prepared a plate for Silas. When he came back inside, stamping the snow from his boots, his cheeks reddened by the cold, she offered it to him wordlessly. He looked surprised. "Ma'am, that's yours." "There's enough," she said firmly. "You brought it. You eat." He took the plate with another quiet nod and sat on the stool Caleb usually occupied by the hearth, eating slowly, deliberately, as if savoring each bite. The children ate with a hunger that was painful to watch, yet wonderful. Sarah, propped up with pillows, managed several bites, color returning faintly to her cheeks. Caleb devoured his portion and looked hopefully towards the remaining bird. "Easy, son," Eliza cautioned gently. "Don't want to make yourself sick after going without." After the meal, a fragile sense of normalcy settled over the cabin. Silas took out a worn Barlow knife and began expertly sharpening it on a whetstone he produced from his pocket. The rhythmic scrape a quiet counterpoint to Sarah's now softer breathing as she drifted off to sleep. Caleb watched him, fascinated. "That a good knife?" Caleb asked, inching closer. "Good enough," Silas replied without looking up. "Kept me fed more than once." "Did you fight Indians with it?" Caleb pressed, eyes wide. Silas paused, his hand stilling. He looked up then, his gaze distant. "Fought plenty of things, boy. Not all of them wear war paint." He went back to sharpening his knife, a curtain seeming to fall over his expression, discouraging further questions about his past. Eliza watched the exchange, her unease returning. Who was this man? He knew how to track, trap, handle an axe, wield a knife, wear a gun. He spoke little of himself, his eyes holding old sorrows or maybe old dangers. Yet he'd shown them kindness, filled their bellies, treated Caleb with quiet respect. He was an enigma, a contradiction wrapped in a dusty coat. Over the next few days, a tentative routine established itself. Silas proved invaluable. He was an expert woodsman and tracker. The day after the storm broke, he fashioned crude snowshoes from bent willow branches and sinew he carried in his saddlebags, then ventured out into the white wilderness. He returned hours later, not empty-handed, but dragging a small buck deer behind him. It felt like a miracle. Meat. Enough meat to see them through weeks, maybe longer if preserved properly. Together, they butchered the deer. Silas worked with a practiced skill that spoke of long experience, showing Caleb how to skin the animal cleanly, how to dress the carcass, which cuts were best for roasting, which for stewing or drying into jerky. Eliza felt a pang watching them, remembering John teaching Caleb similar things, simpler things, in happier times. But this was different. Silas's movements were economical, precise, almost detached, the actions of a man who had relied on these skills for survival for a long, long time. Eliza worked alongside him, cutting the meat into strips for drying, rendering the fat, preparing stew from the tougher cuts. They worked in relative silence, but it was a companionable silence now, born of shared labor and a common goal: survival. She found herself observing him, noticing small things, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, even when indoors near the window, the way he always positioned himself with his back to a wall, the calloused toughness of his hands, marked by old scars alongside the newer ones. He slept in the barn, refusing her offer of a pallet by the fire, preferring the cold and solitude, reinforcing the invisible barrier he kept around himself. He spoke little of where he came from or where he was going. When Eliza gently probed, asking how he came to be riding through their valley in such bad weather, he merely shrugged. Just passing through. Heading north. Got caught out. His answers were brief, deflecting, offering no footholds for deeper inquiry. Yet his actions spoke louder than words. He repaired the sagging barn door, reinforced a weak spot in the cabin roof where snowmelt had started to drip through, kept the woodpile high. He even spent an afternoon patiently carving a small wooden bird for Sarah, his rough hands surprisingly deft. Sarah, recovering her strength day by day thanks to the regular food and warmth, accepted the gift with a shy smile, clutching it almost as tightly as her rag doll. Caleb, meanwhile, had become Silas's shadow, eagerly absorbing the practical skills the older man imparted. He learned how to read tracks in the snow, how to set snares more effectively, how to bank the fire so it lasted through the night. Silas taught him patiently, without condescension, treating him not as a child, but as a young man learning necessary trades. Caleb's confidence grew visibly. He walked taller, the fear in his eyes replaced by a cautious competence. Eliza couldn't deny the immense relief Silas's presence brought. The immediate terror of starvation had receded. The cabin was warmer, more secure. Her children were safer, stronger. But the mystery of Silas remained, a low hum of uncertainty beneath the surface of their temporary peace. Where did he learn these skills? Why was he alone, drifting through the harshest territory in the dead of winter? What was he running from, or towards? And what would happen when the snows melted enough for travel? Would he simply ride away, leaving them to fend for themselves again? Or was his presence a prelude to some other kind of trouble? Her thoughts inevitably turned to Jedediah Thorne. The snows wouldn't keep the passes blocked forever. Sooner or later, Thorne would come calling about the loan. He knew she'd had no harvest, knew John was gone. He probably thought the winter would finish the job for him, leaving the ranch ripe for the picking at a bargain price. The thought of facing him, of potentially losing the home John had built, the only legacy she had left for her children, sent a chill deeper than the winter air through her. Having Silas here, did it make her safer, or did it complicate things? Would Thorne see him as a threat, a hired hand perhaps, or would his presence simply draw unwanted attention? One evening, as the stew bubbled fragrant on the hearth and the wind picked up again outside, rattling the window pane, Silas was cleaning his colt by the firelight, the metallic clicks precise and rhythmic. Caleb watched, mesmerized. "Can I see it?" Caleb asked breathlessly. Silas paused, then carefully finished reassembling the firearm. He held it out, butt first, towards the boy. "Never point it at anything you don't intend to shoot," he said quietly. "And treat every gun like it's loaded, even when you know it ain't." Caleb took the heavy weapon reverently, his eyes shining. He handled it carefully, examining the mechanism. "You good with that?" Caleb asked, looking up at Silas. Silas took the gun back, checking it again before sliding it smoothly into its holster. "Good enough," he repeated his familiar non-committal phrase. But Eliza saw a fleeting shadow cross his face, a tightening around his eyes, as if the question touched a nerve, stirred a memory he preferred to keep buried. Later that night, long after the children were asleep, Eliza couldn't settle. She sat by the dying embers of the fire, watching the play of shadows on the rough log walls. Silas was in the barn, a separate, silent presence just yards away. She felt a strange mix of gratitude and apprehension. He had saved them, undoubtedly. But his past felt like a tangible thing, a dark cloud hovering just out of sight. Could kindness and danger reside so easily in the same man? Out here, she knew, survival often meant making alliances with shadows, taking risks that defied conventional wisdom. She had taken that risk. She could only pray it wouldn't cost her more than she could bear. The wind howled, and the newly acquired security felt as fragile as a thin sheet of ice over deep, dark water. The thaw, when it began, was slow and grudging. Days grew fractionally longer. The sun gained a little warmth, and the edges of the immense snowdrifts began to soften, dripping steadily during the daylight hours, freezing again into treacherous sheets of ice each night. The valley floor turned into a soggy marsh in places, the creek swelling with meltwater, running brown and turbulent. Travel was still difficult, treacherous even, but possible for a determined rider. And Eliza knew, with a sinking feeling in her gut, that Jedediah Thorne was a determined man. Silas seemed to sense the shift too. He grew quieter, if that were possible, his eyes scanning the approaches to the valley more frequently. He spent more time checking his snares further afield, often gone for hours, returning with a brace of rabbits or nothing at all, his expression unreadable. He kept the woodpile high, checked the repairs on the cabin and barn, ensuring everything was as secure as possible. It felt like preparation, but for what? Eliza couldn't be sure. His departure? Or something else? The question hung unspoken between them. His presence had become a fixture, woven into the fabric of their days. Caleb openly hero-worshipped him. Sarah, now fully recovered, would shyly bring him wildflowers she found poking through the melting snow near the cabin. Even Eliza had grown accustomed to his quiet competence, the sense of security his presence provided, however ambiguous his past remained. The thought of him leaving left a hollow feeling, a return to the vulnerability she'd felt before his arrival. But she couldn't ask him to stay. He was a wanderer, that much was clear. He had his own path, his own reasons. One afternoon, Caleb came running back from checking snares near the creek, his face pale, eyes wide with alarm. Ma, rider coming. Looks like Mr. Thorne's buggy." Eliza's heart plummeted. So soon. The ground wasn't even properly dried out. Thorne must have been waiting, eager. Silas, who had been reinforcing a fence post near the barn, straightened up slowly, his eyes narrowed towards the mouth of the valley. He didn't reach for his gun, but his stance shifted, becoming watchful, still. "Inside, Caleb," Eliza ordered, trying to keep her voice calm. "Sarah, stay away from the window." She smoothed her apron, her hands trembling slightly. She glanced toward Silas. He met her gaze, a silent question in his eyes. "What do you want me to do?" She didn't know. His presence could escalate things, or it could deter Thorne. "Just stay back for now, Silas," she murmured. "Let me handle this." He gave a curt nod and moved towards the barn, ostensibly to put away his tools, but positioning himself where he could see the cabin door and anyone approaching it. The buggy rattled into the yard minutes later, pulled by a pair of sturdy horses that made Eliza's own aging mare look pitiful. Jedediah Thorne sat holding the reins, bundled in a thick wool coat, his face impassive. Beside him sat a man Eliza didn't recognize, burly and grim-faced, with eyes that seemed to take in everything, the cabin, the barn, the repaired fence, with a cold, assessing stare. Thorne climbed down stiffly, his movements precise, deliberate. "Afternoon, Widow Moore," Thorne said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. It held a veneer of politeness, but underneath, Eliza heard the familiar chill. "Mr. Thorne," Eliza acknowledged, stepping out onto the porch, forcing herself to stand tall, though her knees felt weak. Didn't expect visitors so soon after the thaw. Thorne's thin lips curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Business waits for no season, Eliza, especially overdue business." He gestured towards the cabin. "Heard you had a hard winter. Sad business about your husband. Terrible loss." The sympathy sounded hollow, rehearsed. "We managed," Eliza said curtly, refusing to show weakness. "Managed?" Thorne raised a skeptical eyebrow. Heard different. Heard things were desperate. His eyes flickered towards the barn, where Silas had momentarily disappeared inside. Yet, things look tidier than expected. Smoke from the chimney, path cleared. You hire some help? The question hung in the air. Eliza hesitated. Admitting Silas was here felt like revealing a vulnerability, yet denying it felt like a lie that could easily be exposed. A drifter, she said carefully. Caught in the storm. Helped out some in exchange for shelter. Thorne's eyes narrowed slightly. The burly man beside him shifted his weight, his hand resting near the pistol holstered on his hip. A drifter, you say? Armed? Before Eliza could answer, Silas emerged from the barn, carrying a saddle. He moved slowly, deliberately, not looking directly at Thorne, but undeniably present. His gun belt was visible beneath his duster. Thorne's gaze fixed on Silas, taking in the worn clothes, the weathered face, the tied-down holster. A flicker of calculation, perhaps unease, crossed Thorne's face. He clearly hadn't expected this. A lone widow was one thing. A widow with a capable-looking, armed man on the premises was another. This him? Thorne asked Eliza, jerking his chin towards Silas, his tone hardening. Name's Silas, Silas said quietly, stopping near the porch, his eyes meeting Thorne's steadily. He didn't offer any more information, just stood there, a silent, watchful presence. Thorne appraised Silas for a long moment, then seemed to dismiss him, turning his attention back to Eliza, though his posture remained tense. Well, Eliza, pleasantries aside, you know why I'm here. The loan John took out. Payment was due 3 months ago. Interest accrues, you understand. I know, Mr. Thorne, Eliza said, her voice tight. The winter, the locusts last year, we had nothing. Unfortunate, Thorne said briskly. Truly, but business is business. The terms were clear. The loan was secured against this property. He gestured expansively, taking in the small cabin, the barn, the meager stretch of land. I hold the deed, contingent on repayment. I intend to pay, Eliza insisted, though she had no idea how. I just need some time. A good harvest this year. Thorne chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. Time? Eliza, be realistic. You think you can work this land alone? Raise a crop sufficient to cover the debt and the accumulated interest? After last year's failures? He shook his head slowly. I'm prepared to be reasonable. Settle the debt now. I'll offer you a fair price for the property, enough to see you and the children settled somewhere. Simpler. Back east, perhaps. Fair price? Eliza knew Thorne's definition of fair. Pennies on the dollar. Enough to get rid of her, not enough to start over anywhere. He wanted the land, probably the water rights that came with it, controlling the creek that flowed through her property before reaching his own extensive holdings downstream. This wasn't about the money owed. It was about acquisition. This is my home, Mr. Thorne, Eliza said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts. My children's home. John built it. We're not leaving. Thorne's expression hardened, the thin veneer of civility cracking. Don't be foolish, woman. You have no means to repay. The contract is clear. I can file for foreclosure tomorrow. Give me until the end of summer, Eliza pleaded, hating the desperation in her own voice. Just until I can bring in a crop, please. Thorne glanced at the burly man, whose name he hadn't bothered to offer, then back at Eliza. Sentiment won't pay the bills, and frankly, I doubt your ability to manage. He took a step closer to the porch. Perhaps your drifter friend thinks he can help? Is he planning on staying, working off your debt? His tone was mocking, insinuating. Silas stiffened almost imperceptibly, his hand moving slightly closer to his gun. Eliza saw the movement and her breath caught. Violence was the last thing they needed. He's just passing through, Eliza said quickly. This is between you and me, Mr. Thorne. Indeed it is, Thorne said smoothly, though his eyes still flickered toward Silas. And my offer is generous, under the circumstances. Think about it, Eliza. I'll give you 24 hours. My man here, he gestured towards the burly associate, Mr. Crabbe, will return tomorrow for your answer. If you haven't agreed to sell by then, I'll have the sheriff serve the foreclosure papers. It's your choice. Keep clinging to false hope, or take what you can get and leave with some dignity." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned abruptly, climbed back into the buggy, Crab following suit. With a sharp flick of the reins, he turned the horses and rattled back down the track, leaving Eliza standing on the porch, shaking, the ultimatum hanging heavy in the cold air. 24 hours. An impossible choice. Sell the land John died for, the only home her children knew, or face foreclosure and be thrown out with nothing. Silas moved closer as the buggy disappeared from view. "Crab," he said quietly, his voice grim. "He rode with the regulators down Texas way some years back. Hired gun, nasty reputation." Eliza stared at him, the information adding another layer of fear. Thorne hadn't just come to talk. He'd come prepared for intimidation, maybe worse. "What am I going to do, Silas?" she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "I can't pay him. I can't leave, but I can't fight him." Silas looked out towards the valley entrance, then back at her, his expression thoughtful, calculating. "Maybe you can't pay him," he said slowly, "but maybe he doesn't have the right to collect." Eliza looked at him, confused. "What do you mean? He has the contract. John signed it." "Contracts can be tricky things," Silas said, his eyes holding a new intensity. "Especially out here. Let me see the papers, Eliza. The loan agreement John signed." Hope, thin and uncertain, flickered again. What could Silas possibly see that she and John hadn't? But she was desperate. She nodded numbly and went inside, rummaging through the small wooden box where John kept their important documents. She found the agreement, the paper slightly worn, John's signature clear at the bottom alongside Thorne's precise script. She brought it out to Silas. He took the document, unfolding it carefully. He read it slowly, methodically, his brow furrowed in concentration. He paid particular attention to the property description, the terms of repayment, the interest rate. He read it through twice, his lips moving slightly. Eliza watched him, holding her breath. Caleb and Sarah peered cautiously from the doorway. Finally, Silas looked up, a strange light in his eyes. "He mentioned water rights, Eliza?" She frowned. "No. Why?" "This agreement," Silas tapped the paper. "It details the land. Section, township, range, standard stuff. But it says nothing, absolutely nothing, about the water rights associated with this parcel." I don't understand," Eliza said. "Does that matter?" Silas's mouth tightened into a grim line. "Out here? Water rights are everything, more valuable than the land itself sometimes, especially that creek running through your property. Thorne's downstream holdings depend on that water flow, particularly in dry years." He looked at her intently. "John, did he ever mention filing a separate claim for the water rights? Or maybe inheriting them from whoever owned this land before?" Eliza searched her memory. John had talked endlessly about the creek, its importance, how lucky they were to have it cutting through their land. He'd mentioned talking to the land office in Cheyenne once, something about ensuring their claim was solid. But the details were hazy, lost in the fog of grief and hardship. I think he might have," she said uncertainly. "He said something once about making sure Thorne couldn't divert the creek upstream. He went to Cheyenne." "If he filed a separate claim for the water rights," Silas said, his voice low and urgent, "and those rights weren't included as collateral in this loan agreement." He paused, letting the implication sink in. "Then Thorne can take the land, maybe, but he can't touch the water. And this land," Silas swept his hand towards the arid-looking pasture beyond the cabin, "without that creek water, especially for Thorne's purposes downstream, it's worth a lot less. Maybe not worth enough for him to push this hard if he knows he can't control the water." A glimmer of understanding sparked in Eliza's mind. "So if I still hold the water rights, he might have leverage over the land," Silas finished. "But you have leverage over the water. It changes the whole game." He looked at the paper again. "Thorne's clever. He likely hoped you wouldn't know, or wouldn't have the proof. Assumed the water went with the land automatically." "But how do we prove it?" Eliza asked desperately. John, he wasn't always organized with paperwork. If there is a separate deed for the water rights, I don't know where it would be. Silas tapped the wooden box she still held. He kept important papers in there. She nodded. Let's look again. Carefully. Sometimes things get tucked away, used as bookmarks, folded inside other documents. They went back inside, hope warring with the fear of disappointment. Together, they emptied the box onto the rough wooden table. Deeds, receipts, letters from family back east, John's honorable discharge from the Union Army, faded tintypes. They sifted through every piece, unfolding brittle papers, examining faded ink. Caleb and Sarah watched, sensing the renewed tension. Nothing. Just the loan agreement, the land deed John received when he first bought the parcel, and miscellaneous papers. Eliza's shoulders slumped. It had been a foolish hope. Silas, however, picked up the original land deed again, the one predating Thorne's loan. It was thicker than the others, folded multiple times. He examined the folds, ran his fingers along the creases. Then carefully he unfolded it completely, smoothing it out on the table. Tucked deep within the final fold, almost invisible, was a smaller, separate sheet of paper, brittle with age. Eliza's breath caught. Silas gently eased it out. It was an official-looking document, bearing the stamp of the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. It described in precise legal terms the allocation of water rights from Willow Creek, specifically granting primary usage rights to the owner of the parcel of land described in the main deed, John Moore's parcel. It was dated shortly after John had purchased the land, long before Thorne's loan. It was signed by the land commissioner and bore John's signature as the claimant. Eliza stared at it, tears blurring her vision. "He did it," she whispered. "He actually did it." Silas let out a slow breath, a rare smile touching the corners of his mouth. Looks like John was smarter than Thorne gave him credit for. He held up the water rights deed. "This, Eliza, this is your leverage, your ace in the hole." "But what do we do?" Eliza asked, clutching the precious document. "Thorne won't just believe us. Crabbe is coming back tomorrow. He won't care about this piece of paper." "No," Silas agreed, his expression hardening again. "Crabbe only understands one thing. But Thorne understands business, and he understands leverage." He looked thoughtful for a moment. "We don't show him this, not yet. Not until we have to." He paused, considering. "Crabbe will come back tomorrow expecting you to cave. When you don't, Thorne will likely send the sheriff with the foreclosure notice. That's when you play your hand, but not directly to Thorne, not at first." "Then who?" Silas's eyes met hers, steady and serious. "The sheriff himself, Sheriff Brody in Lander. Is he Thorne's man?" Eliza considered. Brody was gruff, world-weary, but generally considered fair, if overwhelmed by the vast territory he had to cover. He wasn't known to be in Thorne's pocket, unlike some officials in other counties. I don't think so. He tries to be straight, folks say." "Good," Silas nodded. "When Brody comes, likely with Thorne breathing down his neck, that's when you show him this." He tapped the water rights deed. "Politely inform him that while Mr. Thorne may have a claim on the land according to his agreement, the water rights remain yours, as per this prior, registered claim. Suggest that perhaps Mr. Thorne overlooked this detail when assessing the property's value relative to the loan." Eliza could see the strategy. It wouldn't stop the foreclosure necessarily, but it would drastically change the value proposition for Thorne. Owning the land without guaranteed access to its water was a hollow victory, perhaps even a liability. It might force him to negotiate, to offer a fairer settlement, or even to reconsider entirely. But Crabbe, Eliza worried, what about tomorrow? He won't just leave peacefully when I refuse Thorne's offer. Silas's gaze hardened. "Leave Crabbe to me," he said quietly, his hand resting almost unconsciously near the butt of his Colt. "I'll make sure he understands the message needs delivering back to Thorne without causing you or the children any harm." The air crackled with unspoken menace. Eliza looked at Silas, the protector, the provider, but also the man who knew men like Crabbe, who spoke their language. She saw the potential for violence, the very thing she dreaded, yet his quiet confidence was strangely reassuring. He wasn't seeking a fight, but he wouldn't back down from one if it meant protecting them. It was a dangerous edge to walk, but it felt like the only path they had left. "All right, Silas," she said, taking a deep breath. The water rights deed clutched tightly in her hand like a talisman. "We'll do it your way." The next 24 hours crawled by, thick with anticipation and dread. Eliza tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy for the children, but her mind kept replaying Thorne's threats, imagining Crab's arrival. Silas was a quiet, steady presence. He checked his colt meticulously, oiled the action until it moved with silent precision. He walked the perimeter of the property, his eyes missing nothing. He didn't speak of the coming confrontation, but his preparedness was palpable. Caleb, sensing the tension, stuck close to Silas, watching him with a mixture of fear and admiration. As midday approached, the time Thorne had specified, Eliza stood by the window watching the track. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Silas positioned himself on the porch, leaning casually against a post, whittling a piece of wood, but his duster was arranged just so, allowing easy access to his firearm. Caleb was inside, instructed to keep Sarah calm and stay hidden. Right on time, a lone rider appeared at the mouth of the valley. Not Thorne's buggy this time, just Crab on a big roan horse, his face set in a grim scowl. He rode directly into the yard, stopping a few feet from the porch, his hand already resting on the butt of his gun. "Well, widow?" Crab's voice was rough, grating. "Got an answer for Mr. Thorne? Or do I gotta start moving your things out?" Eliza stepped out onto the porch, Silas rising slowly from his lean, the piece of wood and knife disappearing into his pocket. She took a breath, channeling a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Tell Mr. Thorne his offer is not acceptable," she said, her voice clearer, firmer than she'd expected. "We are not selling, and we are not leaving." Crab's eyes narrowed, surprise warring with anger. He spat onto the ground. "Foolish woman. Thorne ain't gonna like that." His gaze flickered to Silas, who stood motionless, watchful. "Reckon your hired man here thinks he can change things?" "I ain't hired," Silas said, his voice dangerously soft. "Just neighborly. And the lady gave you her answer." Crab bristled. "This ain't your business, Drifter. Stay out of it." He swung down from his horse, taking a step towards the porch, his hand tightening on his gun. "Thorne wants this place. He's gonna get it, one way or another." "Not today," Silas said, shifting his weight slightly, his eyes locking with Crab's. The air grew thick, heavy with imminent violence. Eliza held her breath, her hand gripping the doorframe. Crab hesitated, clearly assessing Silas. He saw the steady eyes, the worn gun belt, the quiet readiness. He was a bully, a hired thug, likely used to intimidating women and unarmed ranchers. Facing a man like Silas, who met his gaze without flinching, gave him pause. He wasn't paid enough to die for Thorne's land grab, not if there was an easier way. "Thorne ain't gonna forget this," Crab snarled, trying to save face. "You tell the widow she just made a big mistake." "Message received," Silas said evenly. "Now move along. You're trespassing." For a tense moment, neither man moved. Then, Crab, perhaps deciding discretion was the better part of valor when facing an unknown quantity like Silas, slowly backed away. He remounted his horse, shot one last venomous look towards the cabin, and wheeled the roan around, kicking it into a gallop back down the track. Eliza let out the breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her legs suddenly weak. Silas watched until Crab was out of sight, his posture slowly relaxing. "He'll tell Thorne," Silas said, turning back to her. "Thorne won't be happy. Expect the sheriff soon. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe the day after." "You faced him down," Eliza whispered, looking at Silas with newfound awe, mixed with trepidation. "Without drawing." Silas shrugged, his expression unreadable again. "Sometimes the threat is enough. Crabs kind understand posture, but don't mistake it, Eliza. Thorne won't back down easy. This just bought us time. The real fight is still coming." He looked towards Lander. "Get ready for the sheriff." True to Silas's prediction, Sheriff Brody arrived 2 days later. He didn't come alone. Jedediah Thorne rode beside him in his buggy, his face a mask of smug righteousness. Crabbe followed on horseback, looking surly. Brody looked uncomfortable, his gaze shifting apologetically towards Eliza as he dismounted. "Afternoon, Eliza," Brody said gruffly. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a drooping mustache and tired eyes. "Sorry to be here on this kind of business." "Sheriff," Eliza acknowledged calmly. Silas stood nearby, watchful but unobtrusive. Thorne didn't bother with pleasantries this time. "Sheriff, serve the papers. The woman refuses to vacate the property defaulted on her loan agreement. She's trespassing." Brody sighed, pulling a folded document from his coat pocket. "Eliza, I got a court order here. Foreclosure. Says Thorne has legal title now, due to non-payment." He held it out reluctantly. "I gotta ask you to vacate the premises." Eliza didn't take the paper. Instead, she produced the water rights deed she'd kept carefully hidden. "Sheriff Brody," she said, her voice steady, "I understand Mr. Thorne has a claim based on the loan agreement regarding the land itself, though I maintain the circumstances were beyond my control." She held up the second document. "However, it seems Mr. Thorne may have overlooked a prior registered claim. This document, filed with the Territorial Land Office some years ago by my late husband, establishes clear and separate ownership of the primary water rights associated with Willow Creek on this property. These rights were not included as collateral in Mr. Thorne's loan agreement." Thorne's head snapped around, his eyes bulging slightly as he saw the official-looking paper in Eliza's hand. "What nonsense is this?" he sputtered. "The water goes with the land. It's implied." "Not always, Mr. Thorne," Sheriff Brody said slowly, taking the document Eliza offered him. He unfolded it, reading it carefully, his eyebrows rising. He compared the property description to the one on the foreclosure notice. He looked from Thorne to Eliza, then back at the deed in his hand. "Well, This is preposterous," Thorne blustered, his face turning an ugly shade of red. "A trick! That document can't be genuine." "Looks genuine to me, Jedediah," Brody said mildly, holding it up. "Got the territorial seal, commissioner's signature, looks properly filed and recorded. Says here clear as day, the water rights for this parcel belong to the owner named herein, John Moore, and presumably his heir, Eliza, separate from any subsequent liens on the land itself, unless specified." He looked at Thorne pointedly. "And your loan agreement, the one this foreclosure is based on, makes no mention of water rights being part of the collateral." Thorne looked apoplectic, sputtering incoherently for a moment. Crabbe shifted uneasily behind him. Silas remained quiet, letting the legal document do the talking. "So," Brody continued, scratching his mustache thoughtfully, "while you might have a claim to the land, Thorne, looks like Mrs. Moore here still controls the water, and Willow Creek cuts right through this property before it gets down to yours, don't it?" The implication was clear. Thorne stared at Eliza, his eyes filled with venom. He understood immediately. The land without the water was almost useless to him, certainly not worth the price of the original loan, let alone the trouble he was going to. Owning the banks didn't mean he could divert or dam the creek if she held the primary usage rights. She could, theoretically, use almost all the water for her own irrigation, leaving his downstream pastures high and dry. His leverage had just evaporated. "This changes things," Brody said, folding both documents. "The foreclosure on the land itself might stand, legally speaking, based on the loan. But enforcing it while Mrs. Moore retains the water rights, that's a complicated matter. Might require further court action, interpretation." He looked pointedly at Thorne. "Seems to me, Jedediah, you might want to reconsider your position. Maybe negotiate a settlement Mrs. Moore finds acceptable. Owning land you can't water ain't much of a bargain." Thorne glared at Eliza, then at Silas, who met his gaze evenly. He saw the determination in Eliza's face, the quiet strength of the man beside her, the legal complication presented by the sheriff. He was trapped. Pushing the foreclosure now would be costly, lengthy, and might not even yield the prize he truly wanted, control of the water. He drew himself up, regaining a semblance of composure, though his fists were clenched white. "This isn't over, Brody," he spat. "And you," he glared at Eliza, "you'll regret this." He turned sharply. "Crab, let's go." He stalked back to his buggy without another word, Crab following sullenly. They rode away, defeated for the moment, leaving a tense silence in their wake. Sheriff Brody watched them go, then turned back to Eliza, handing her the water rights deed. "That was unexpected, Eliza. You played that smart." He looked toward Silas with grudging respect. "Reckon you had something to do with this?" Silas just shrugged. "Just pointed out the fine print, Sheriff." Brody nodded slowly. "Well, Thorne won't give up easy. He's got lawyers. But that water rights claim gives you breathing room. A lot of it." He tipped his hat. "Keep that document safe, Eliza. Real safe." He mounted his horse. "Holler if there's more trouble you can't handle." With a final nod, he rode off towards Lander, leaving Eliza, Silas, and the children standing in the yard, the immediate threat averted. Eliza looked down at the brittle piece of paper in her hand, John's foresight reaching across time to protect them. Then she looked at Silas, the mysterious stranger who had not only saved them from starvation, but had also found the key to saving their home. Gratitude washed over her, immense and profound. But questions still lingered. Why had he helped? What did he know about legal matters, about men like Crab and Thorne? The enigma remained, but now it was intertwined with a deep sense of debt. "Thank you, Silas," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. You saved us, again." He met her gaze, and for a fleeting moment, the usual reserve in his eyes softened, revealing a glimpse of something deeper, perhaps a shared understanding of loss, of fighting against overwhelming odds. "Just glad I could help, Eliza," he said quietly. "John, he did the important part, securing this." He gestured towards the deed. "He looked out for you." The mention of John brought a fresh wave of emotion. Yes, John had looked out for them. And now, in a strange twist of fate, this quiet, dangerous stranger had too. The future was still uncertain. Thorne wouldn't simply disappear. The challenges of working the ranch remained. But for the first time in a long time, Eliza felt not just the fragile hope she'd nurtured earlier, but a solid foundation beneath her feet. They had weathered the storm, faced the wolf at the door, and somehow they had held their ground. The confrontation hadn't ended in violence, but in the quiet power of a forgotten piece of paper and the courage to use it. It felt like a victory, hard won and precious. As the days turned into weeks, and spring began to assert itself more confidently across the valley, a semblance of peace settled over the Moore homestead. The grass greened, wildflowers dotted the slopes, and the air grew soft with the promise of warmer weather. Thorne made no further moves, seemingly licking his wounds and reconsidering his strategy now that the water rights issue had surfaced. The threat hadn't vanished entirely, Eliza knew. Men like Thorne harbored grudges, but the immediate pressure was off. Silas stayed. He didn't speak of leaving, nor did Eliza ask him to stay. It was an unspoken arrangement, born of shared crisis and mutual, if cautious, respect. He fell into the rhythm of the ranch work, helping Eliza prepare the small field John had cleared, turning the soil, mending fences broken by the heavy snows. His knowledge seemed boundless. He knew when to plant the meager seeds Eliza had managed to save, how to reinforce the small irrigation ditch from the creek, to maximize the water flow without violating any regulations, how to read the weather signs in the clouds and the wind. He remained reserved, volunteering little about his past, deflecting personal questions with vague answers or by changing the subject. Yet small cracks appeared in his armor. Eliza noticed he sometimes watched Caleb and Sarah playing near the cabin with a wistful, almost pained expression. Once, Sarah tripped and scraped her knee, crying out. Before Eliza could react, Silas was there, kneeling beside her, examining the scrape with surprising gentleness, his rough voice soothing her tears. He cleaned the wound with water from his canteen and bound it with a strip of clean cloth from his own kit, his touch unexpectedly tender. Caleb continued to thrive under Silas's tutelage, learning not just practical skills but a quiet sort of confidence. Silas taught him how to track game more effectively, how to fish the creek with a simple line and hook, how to handle the rifle safely and accurately, emphasizing respect for the weapon and the life it could take. He wasn't just teaching survival skills, he was imparting a code, a way of carrying oneself in a hard land. Eliza found herself relying on Silas, not just for the physical labor, but for his quiet presence, his steady competence. They worked side by side, repairing the cabin roof properly, planting the garden, tending the single milk cow John had left them. They spoke more easily now, conversation flowing naturally about the tasks at hand, the weather, the children. But the deeper questions about who he was, what brought him to her door, remained unasked, hanging in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. She learned he could read. One evening she saw him examining the worn Bible that had belonged to her mother, his finger tracing the lines of text. When he noticed her watching, he closed it quickly, a faint flush rising on his weathered cheeks. "Just lookin'," he mumbled, placing it back carefully on the shelf. "You read well," Eliza commented gently. He shrugged. "Had some schoolin', long time ago." He didn't elaborate. The mystery deepened. A man skilled in tracking, trapping, fighting, yet capable of gentle acts, literate, possessing knowledge of law and farming. Who was Silas? Was he an outlaw laying low? A lawman undercover? Someone escaping a tragedy? The possibilities churned in Eliza's mind. She owed him everything, her children's lives, her home. Gratitude warred with a persistent unease, a feeling that his past, whatever it was, might still catch up to him and engulf them all. One clear evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and rose, they sat on the porch, watching the children chase fireflies near the creek bank. A comfortable silence stretched between them. "You ever think about settling down?" Eliza asked tentatively, breaking the quiet. "Finding a place?" Silas stared out at the darkening mountains, his profile stark against the fading light. "Tried once," he said, his voice low, rougher than usual. "Didn't take." A beat of silence. "Why not?" she pressed gently. He turned his head, his eyes shadowed, reflecting the twilight. "Some things follow a man, Eliza. Things you can't outrun, no matter how far you ride." He looked away again, towards the mountains, a barrier falling firmly back into place. "Best not to put down roots. Less hurt when you gotta pull 'em up again." The words hung there, heavy with unspoken pain, hinting at a loss or a danger that kept him perpetually moving. Eliza didn't push further. She understood walls. She had built plenty of her own since John's death. She just nodded slowly, accepting the boundary he'd drawn. But her heart ached with a sudden, sharp pang. For him, for the loneliness she sensed beneath his stoic exterior, and perhaps for the growing connection she felt towards this enigmatic man, a connection that seemed destined to be transient. The relative peace was shattered abruptly a few weeks later. A lone rider approached the cabin, not Thorne or Crab, but a man Eliza recognized vaguely from Lander Jim Riley, who sometimes ran errands for Sheriff Brody. He looked agitated, his horse lathered from hard riding. "Mrs. Moore," he called out as he drew near. Silas, instantly alert, stepped out from the barn. "Sheriff Brody sent me. There's trouble." "What kind of trouble?" Eliza asked, her stomach tightening. "Word came down from Cheyenne," Riley panted, dismounting. "Pinkerton agents. They're tracking a fugitive heading this way, man named Silas Kane. Wanted for bank robbery and murder back in Kansas. They got a description. Fits him." Riley gestured awkwardly towards Silas, avoiding his gaze. The world seemed to tilt under Eliza's feet. Silas Kane. Not just Silas. Silas Kane. Fugitive, robber, murderer. She stared at the man who had saved her family, shared their home, earned her trust, her gratitude, perhaps even her affection. His face was impassive, carved from stone, but his eyes— she saw a flicker of something deep and desolate in their depths. A confirmation. He hadn't denied it. He just stood there, absorbing the blow, the quiet finally broken, the past catching up with brutal finality. "They passed through Lander this morning," Riley continued, clearly uncomfortable. Asking questions. Brody tried to stall him, sent me ahead to warn folks, said they were heading towards the passes, likely sweeping through these outlying valleys looking for any sign. He looked at Silas again, then quickly away. Sheriff said he don't want bloodshed on his territory if it can be helped. But these Pinkertons, they got warrants, and they shoot first. Silas Kane. The name echoed in the sudden ringing silence. Eliza felt Caleb and Sarah pressing close behind her, sensing the sudden terrifying shift in the atmosphere. She looked at Silas, seeing not just the kind helper, the skilled woodsman, but the man the law was hunting, the man with a violent past. The gun on his hip suddenly looked menacing, not protective. The scar on his cheek seemed sinister. All the small signs, the guardedness, the skills, the weariness, clicked into a terrible new perspective. Silas finally moved. He looked not at Riley, but at Eliza, his eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. Regret, resignation, perhaps apology. "Reckon my time's run out, Eliza," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Best I move on. Draw them away from here." Move on? Just like that? After everything? Anger warred with fear and a confusing sense of betrayal. Had it all been a lie? His kindness, his help, was it just a means to an end, a way to hide? You lied to us," she choked out, the words bitter. "All this time." Pain flashed across his face, raw and undisguised. "Didn't lie about needing shelter, Eliza. Didn't lie about wanting to help." He took a step towards her, his hands held out slightly, palms open, a gesture of supplication. "The rest, the name. What happened back in Kansas? It's complicated, not as simple as they make it sound." "Murder isn't simple, Silas," she cried, tears of anger and disillusionment stinging her eyes. "Robbery isn't simple." "No," he agreed quietly. "It ain't." He glanced towards the mountains, towards the passes the Pinkertons would be searching. "But they won't listen to explanations. They just want a rope." He looked back at her, his gaze intense. "I gotta go. Now. Before they get here. Keep you and the children out of it." He turned towards the barn to get his horse. "Wait!" Caleb suddenly burst out, stepping forward, his face streaked with tears, his voice trembling. "Don't go. You can hide. We can help you." Silas paused, looking down at the boy who had come to idolize him. He knelt, putting a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Can't hide forever, Caleb," he said gently. "And I won't put you folks in danger. You gotta be strong now. Look after your ma and Sarah. You learned good. You'll manage." "But what about Mr. Thorne?" Caleb sobbed. "What if he comes back?" Silas's jaw tightened. He stood up, looking at Eliza again. "Thorne knows about the water rights. Sheriff Brody knows. He won't move rashly now. You hold that deed, Eliza. That's your shield." He hesitated, then reached inside his duster, pulling out a small, worn leather pouch. He pressed it into her hand. "It ain't much, but maybe it'll help tide you over till you get a crop in." Eliza looked down. The pouch clinked softly. Coin. More than just a few dollars. Where had it come from? The robbery? The thought made her stomach churn. She almost threw it back at him, but the desperation of their situation, the memory of the gnawing hunger, stayed her hand. "I got a ride," Silas said urgently, turning back towards the barn. "Riley, tell Brody. Tell him I'm heading north, towards the Owl Creeks. Maybe that'll buy some time. Draw them off this valley." Riley nodded numbly. Silas disappeared into the barn. Moments later, he emerged leading his horse, already saddled. He swung up, settling into the worn leather. He looked down at Eliza, at Caleb, at Sarah hiding behind her skirts, his face etched with a profound sadness. "Take care, Eliza," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Then, with a touch of his heels, he urged the horse forward, not back down the track towards Lander, but striking out across the valley floor, heading northwest towards the rugged, remote mountains known as the Owl Creek Range Wild Country, difficult terrain, a place a man could disappear or die trying. Eliza watched him go, a whirlwind of conflicting emotions tearing through her. Anger, betrayal, fear, confusion, and underneath it all, a persistent, aching gratitude that she couldn't extinguish. The man who had saved them was a fugitive, a killer. The protector was the one bringing danger to their doorstep. The mysterious wanderer's secrets were finally revealed, and they were darker than she could have imagined. She clutched the pouch of coins, its weight heavy in her hand, feeling tainted, yet necessary. As Silas Kane rode away, becoming a smaller and smaller figure against the vast indifference of the landscape, Eliza felt a profound sense of loss and a terrifying uncertainty about what would happen next. The Pinkertons were coming, and the fragile peace of their valley was well and truly broken. The dust Silas Kane kicked up had barely settled when the sound of more riders reached them, heavier, faster, more purposeful than Riley's urgent arrival. 3 men, dressed in city clothes ill-suited for the rugged terrain but armed with repeating rifles held at the ready, galloped into the yard. They wore determined, hard-eyed expressions. Pinkertons. Their leader, a sharp-featured man with cold gray eyes, surveyed the cabin, the barn, Eliza, and the children with a sweeping, dismissive glance. Riley stood nervously to one side. "Ma'am," the lead agent snapped, his voice clipped and impatient. "We're looking for a fugitive. Silas Kane. Seen him?" Eliza's heart pounded. Lie? Tell the truth? Protecting Silas felt like complicity, yet betraying the man who had saved her family felt impossible. She glanced at Riley, who gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Brody's message: divert them if possible. There was a man," Eliza stammered, trying to sound flustered and afraid, which wasn't difficult. "Stayed here a while, helped out after the storm, left just now." The agent's eyes sharpened. "Which way did he go?" Eliza pointed vaguely towards the north, in the general direction Silas had ridden. "Said he was heading north. Towards the Owl Creek Mountains, I think." It wasn't a complete lie. The agent exchanged a look with his men. "Owl Creek's rough country. Good place to hide." He peered at Eliza suspiciously. "You shelterin' him long?" "He was just a drifter," Eliza insisted, clutching Sarah closer. "Helped with chores in exchange for food and shelter in the barn. We didn't know who he was. Honest." The agent seemed inclined to believe her, or perhaps was simply too focused on the pursuit to waste time grilling a frightened widow. "All right, check the barn," he ordered one of his men. "See if he left anything behind." The man dismounted and headed towards the barn. The leader turned back to Eliza. "If you see him again or hear anything, you contact Sheriff Brody immediately. Harboring a fugitive is a serious crime, ma'am." "Yes, sir," Eliza whispered. The agent who searched the barn returned quickly, shaking his head. "Nothing, boss. Place is clean. Just some tools. Bit of hay." "Right," the leader said, gathering his reins. "Let's ride. He can't have gotten far." With curt nods, the 3 Pinkertons spurred their horses, thundering out of the yard and heading northwest, following the direction Eliza had indicated, the direction Silas Kane had taken. Eliza watched them go, relief washing over her so intensely her knees nearly buckled. They were gone. They hadn't searched the cabin. They hadn't harmed the children. And they were following Silas, hopefully drawn away from the main routes, away from Lander. Riley let out a long breath. "That was close, Mrs. Moore. Real close." He wiped sweat from his brow. Brody was hoping Silas would head for the deep wilderness, give him a run for their money, keep the trouble out of town. "Will they catch him?" Eliza asked, watching the dust cloud raised by the pursuing agents. Riley shrugged, his expression grim. "Pinkertons? They're relentless. And Kane, well, his luck had to run out sometime. But that Owl Creek country, a man can disappear there if he knows what he's doing, or break his neck." He mounted his horse. "I gotta get back. Tell Brody they took the bait. You take care now, Mrs. Moore. Bolt your door good tonight." He rode off, leaving Eliza and the children alone once more in the suddenly vast and threatening silence. Eliza drew Caleb and Sarah inside, latching the door firmly. The pouch Silas had given her felt heavy in her apron pocket. She pulled it out, emptying the contents onto the table. A scattering of silver dollars and even a few gold coins. More money than she'd seen in years. Enough to buy supplies, seed for a larger planting, maybe even make a payment to Thorne if necessary. But it felt wrong. Blood money? Stolen money? Ma? Caleb asked tentatively. Is Silas really a bad man, like they said? Eliza looked at her son, at his confused, trusting face. How could she explain the complexity of it? The man who had saved them, taught him, shown kindness, was also a fugitive accused of terrible crimes. I don't know, Caleb, she answered honestly, sinking onto the stool. Sometimes people do bad things for reasons we don't understand. Sometimes they make mistakes. But he helped us when no one else would. Remember that? She tucked the money away, hiding it beneath a loose floorboard where John used to keep his savings. She couldn't bring herself to spend it yet, but she couldn't bring herself to throw it away either. It was a tangible reminder of Silas Kane, the enigma, the savior, the fugitive. Life returned to a strained version of normalcy. Eliza and Caleb worked the field, planting the seeds they bought in Lander with hoarded egg money, saving Silas's coins for true emergencies. Eliza made the trip cautiously, finding the town buzzing with talk of the manhunt. Sheriff Brody gave her a reassuring nod, but offered no news. The Pinkertons had apparently vanished into the mountains after Kane, and no word had come back. Thorne was conspicuously absent, perhaps waiting to see how the situation with Silas resolved before making his next move. The shadow of Silas's departure and the revelation of his past hung over the homestead. Caleb was quieter, more withdrawn, the loss of his mentor keenly felt. Sarah asked about Mr. Silas sometimes, her innocent questions twisting Eliza's heart. Eliza herself felt adrift, grappling with her conflicting feelings. Gratitude, anger, pity, fear, they churned within her. She found herself scanning the northern ridges, wondering if Silas was still out there, alive, running, hiding. Had he truly been a cold-blooded killer? Or was there truth in his claim that things were complicated? She would likely never know. Summer deepened. The crops grew, promising a modest harvest, enough perhaps to keep starvation at bay through the next winter, but not enough to truly escape the specter of debt. Eliza worked relentlessly, driven by a fierce determination to hold on to the land, to prove Thorne wrong, to build a future for her children on her own terms. Yet the loneliness felt heavier now, the silence of the cabin more profound without Silas's quiet presence. One hot afternoon in late July, while Eliza was weeding the garden and the children were playing near the creek, she saw a rider approaching. Not Thorne, not Riley, not lawmen. A single rider, leading a pack horse, moving slowly, deliberately. Her heart leaped into her throat. Could it be? Silas? Had he somehow evaded the Pinkertons and circled back? But as the rider drew closer, she saw it wasn't Silas. This man was older, slighter, dressed in dusty but respectable clothes, wearing spectacles perched on his nose. He looked more like a scholar or a clerk than a frontiersman. He stopped his horse near the cabin, looking around uncertainly before spotting Eliza. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, his voice polite, slightly hesitant. "Might you be Mrs. Eliza Moore?" "I am," Eliza replied cautiously, wiping her hands on her apron, wondering what business a man like this could possibly have with her. The man dismounted, removing his hat respectfully. "My name is Samuel Holloway, ma'am. I'm an attorney from Cheyenne." An attorney? Eliza's apprehension grew. Was this another move from Thorne? "What do you want?" she asked warily. "I've come regarding the estate of a client," Mr. Holloway said, adjusting his spectacles. A man who sometimes went by the name Silas Kane." Eliza stared at him, speechless. Silas? Estate? Did that mean? Mr. Holloway seemed to read her unspoken question. "I'm afraid Mr. Kane passed away recently, Mrs. Moore." The words hit Eliza like a physical blow. Silas was dead. The Pinkertons, she assumed, caught and killed like a hunted animal. Despite everything, a wave of grief washed over her, sharp and unexpected. "How?" she whispered. "It seems it was an accident," Holloway said gently. "A fall in the Owl Creek Mountains. A sheepherder found him several weeks ago. Apparently, he'd been lying there for some time before that. He hesitated. There was no sign of foul play, according to the authorities who investigated. The Pinkerton agents had actually given up the search and left the territory weeks before he was found. An accident. Not gunfire, but a fall. Alone in the wilderness. The image was bleak, desolate. But why come to me? Eliza asked, confused. I barely knew him. Ah, Holloway cleared his throat. That's the rather unusual part. Mr. Kane, or rather Mr. Silas Kingston, that was his legal name, it seems, contacted my office in Cheyenne some time ago before his recent troubles resurfaced. He made arrangements, established a will. It appears he had come into some inheritance himself not long before, quite unexpectedly. Silas Kingston. Another name. An inheritance. The story grew stranger. His will is quite specific, Holloway continued, reaching into his saddlebag and pulling out a thick envelope sealed with wax. After settling some outstanding obligations and legal fees associated with clearing his name posthumously regarding the Kansas affair documentation, for which he also provided my office, suggesting a wrongful conviction or extenuating circumstances he hoped to prove eventually, he named a primary beneficiary for the remainder of his estate. He paused, looking directly at Eliza. He named you, Mrs. Eliza Moore, and your children, Caleb and Sarah. Eliza swayed, grabbing onto the porch railing for support. Her? His beneficiary? It made no sense. Why? He left a letter, Holloway said softly, holding out the sealed envelope. To explain, perhaps. The remainder of the estate, after all disbursements, is quite substantial, Mrs. Moore. Enough to clear any debts on this property, purchase livestock equipment, ensure your children's education, enough to provide security for many years to come. Eliza took the envelope numbly. Her fingers trembled as she broke the wax seal. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, covered in surprisingly neat handwriting. Silas's handwriting. Eliza, it began. If you are reading this, then my time ran out, one way or another. I expect you know the worst of it now. The name Kane, the charges. There's truth in it, but not the whole truth. The robbery. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. People got hurt who shouldn't have. I made choices I regret, fell in with the wrong company after I lost my own family. Fever took my wife and daughter years back. Lost my way after that. Did things I ain't proud of. Getting word of an inheritance from a distant uncle I never knew felt like a joke at first. Then maybe a chance to start over, clear my name. But trouble found me again before I could. Coming across your cabin in that storm. Seeing you and the children struggling. It reminded me of what I lost, of what matters. Helping you felt like doing something right for a change. You showed me kindness when you had every reason not to. You and Caleb and Sarah. You gave me a glimpse of what a home felt like again, even knowing I couldn't stay, knowing what I was. I can't undo the past, but maybe I can help secure your future. The money, it's clean. From the inheritance, not the other business. Use it. Pay off Thorne. Keep the ranch John built for you. Give Caleb and Sarah the chances they deserve. Don't let the land break you like it almost broke me. Forgive me if you can, Eliza, for the secrets, for the danger I brought. Thank you for the shelter, for the food, but mostly for reminding me what decency looked like. Silas. Silas Kingston. Tears streamed down Eliza's face as she read the letter, blurring the words. Loss, regret, sacrifice, a desperate attempt at redemption. It wasn't a confession, nor a full exoneration, but it was human. Flawed, broken, but ultimately striving for something better. He hadn't been simply a monster or a saint. He was a man shaped by tragedy and mistakes, who, in the end, had tried to leave something good behind. She looked up at Mr. Holloway, the letter clutched in her hand. I accept, she whispered. Holloway nodded kindly. There are papers to sign, arrangements to make in Lander. I can assist you with everything. Paying off Mr. Thorne should be the first order of business, I imagine. A small smile touched his lips. I believe his leverage has well and truly vanished now. Later that day, After Mr. Holloway had departed towards Lander to make arrangements at the bank and the courthouse, Eliza sat on the porch, the setting sun casting long shadows across the valley. Caleb and Sarah sat beside her, quiet, sensing the gravity of the day's events. She had explained, as best she could, that Mr. Silas had left them enough money to keep the ranch, that they wouldn't have to worry about Mr. Thorne anymore, that he had wanted to help them have a better future. She looked out at the land, John's legacy, her burden, now suddenly, miraculously, secure. It had been saved not just by John's foresight with the water rights, but by the unexpected, posthumous generosity of a fugitive seeking redemption, a complex, bittersweet kind of salvation. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Running the ranch, raising her children alone, it would still demand strength, resilience, hard work. But the crushing weight of desperation, the gnawing fear of imminent loss, was gone, lifted by the final act of Silas Kingston. She thought about the nature of justice on the frontier. It wasn't always clean or simple. Sometimes it came through legal loopholes, sometimes through quiet acts of defiance, sometimes through the flawed choices of broken men seeking to make amends. She thought about judging strangers, about the masks people wore, the hidden burdens they carried. Silas had worn many masks: drifter, helper, fugitive, benefactor. She had feared him, trusted him, resented him, and now mourned him. His final act wasn't just about money. It was about restoring hope, offering a future. It was a testament to the fact that even in the harshest circumstances, shadowed by the darkest pasts, the capacity for kindness, for sacrifice, for seeking redemption could endure. It was a hard-won lesson, paid for in hardship and loss, but it resonated deep within her soul. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods by the creek, carrying the scent of dust and pine and the coming coolness of night. It sounded different now, not mournful, but perhaps peaceful. Eliza pulled her children close, feeling the solid reality of the porch beneath her, the vast Wyoming sky above, and the enduring strength of the human spirit within her. They had survived. They would endure. And they would remember the mysterious wanderer who, in saving them, perhaps found a measure of salvation for himself.